The courtroom was not supposed to feel this heavy. It was an ordinary weekday morning, the kind when lawyers shuffled stacks of papers and clerks clicked their pens in quiet rhythm. But on this day, silence wrapped the room like a thick fog. Everyone knew the stakes. At the center of the case was not a hardened criminal, not a celebrity defendant, not even a seasoned witness. It was a 3-year-old child. She sat in a chair much too big for her small body, her legs dangling, toes unable to reach the floor. A pink dress, wrinkled from hours of waiting, hung loosely on her frame. In her tiny hands, she clutched a stuffed rabbit, its fur matted from years of love and wear. Her wide brown eyes scanned the room, but she avoided looking at the judge. She avoided the lawyers. She avoided everyone. The entire courtroom leaned forward in anticipation. For days, the case had been building toward this very moment. The little girl's words were supposed to bring clarity, to open a door to truth that no one else could. But now, as she sat silently before a sea of strangers, it became painfully clear. The most important witness was locked behind a wall of fear. The prosecutor, a woman with years of experience in sensitive trials, tried to keep her voice soft, almost like she was speaking to her own child. "Sweetheart," she began gently, "can you tell us your name?" The question was simple. Too simple to fail, everyone thought. But the girl only blinked. Her lips trembled slightly, her grip on the stuffed rabbit tightening as though the fabric could shield her from the world. She didn't say a word. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Reporters shifted in their seats, pens hovering, waiting for the first quote. The defense attorney raised an eyebrow, already sensing opportunity. The judge tapped his gavel softly, not in anger, but in a quiet attempt to restore calm. "Take your time," the prosecutor said kindly. "There's no rush." But time was already the enemy. The judge leaned back, studying the child with tired eyes. He had presided over dozens of cases in his career, but nothing prepared him for moments like this. How could justice depend on a toddler's ability to find her voice? And yet, it did. The silence grew unbearable. The child's mother sat in the back row, her face etched with both hope and guilt. She had begged her daughter to be brave. She had told her that speaking up was the only way to make the hurting stop. But now, seeing her daughter frozen in fear, she wished she could take it all back, scoop her up in her arms, and run out of the courtroom forever. The prosecutor tried again. "Do you see this bunny you're holding? Can you tell us what his name is?" Again, nothing. Not a sound. The little girl's eyes darted to the defense attorney, a tall man with sharp features and an intimidating presence. He didn't smile. He didn't soften his gaze. To the child, he was just another stranger staring, waiting for her to speak. Her shoulders hunched forward, and she pressed her face against the rabbit's ear. One of the jurors shifted uncomfortably, whispering to another, "She's just a baby. How can they expect her to go through this?" The whisper, though quiet, carried in the hushed room. Heads nodded. The defense attorney stood. "Your Honor, I think it's clear this child is not capable of providing reliable testimony. We cannot rely on silence as evidence." His words sliced through the room. For a moment, the prosecutor felt her stomach drop. She knew he wasn't wrong. The court couldn't move forward without testimony. But she also knew the silence wasn't proof of nothing. It was proof of everything. Fear, trauma, pain too deep for words. The judge raised a hand. "Sit down, counselor. We will give her time." But how much time did they have? The little girl began to rock slightly in her chair. A nervous rhythm, her bunny pressed tightly against her chest. She wanted to disappear. She wanted the questions to stop, the stares to vanish, the cold room to melt away. But most of all, she wanted to feel safe. And nothing in this towering room of adults felt safe. The prosecutor, sensing the child's spiraling fear, decided to try another tactic. She crouched low, bringing herself almost level with the girl. "It's okay," she whispered softly. "You're not in trouble. You're safe here. Everyone here just wants to help you." But those words, though well-meaning, bounced off the wall of silence. The child blinked, tears pooling at the edges of her eyes. Her lips opened just slightly, as though she might speak, but then she closed them again and buried her face in her stuffed toy. The moment stretched on. The silence became its own character in the room, louder than words, heavier than arguments. In the gallery, a reporter scribbled furiously, already crafting the headline, "3-year-old refuses to speak in courtroom drama." The defense attorney smirked. The prosecutor clenched her jaw. The judge rubbed his temples. And the little girl? She sat, voiceless, as though trapped behind glass no one could break. What no one realized yet was that this silence wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Because sometimes the truth doesn't come when demanded by authority, or coaxed by kindness, or ordered by a gavel. Sometimes it comes when the heart finds an unexpected ally. But in that moment, the courtroom didn't know it. All they knew was that the case, the entire pursuit of justice, now hung on the fragile shoulders of a 3-year-old child who refused to speak. The judge sighed, his voice low and deliberate. "We will take a recess." Chairs scraped against the floor. Lawyers gathered their notes. Reporters whispered frantically into phones. The defense attorney adjusted his tie, confident this silence was his advantage. And in the middle of it all, the little girl remained motionless in her chair, clutching her rabbit, her silence louder than any gavel. When the judge called for recess, the tension in the courtroom spilled into the hallways, like steam escaping from a kettle. Lawyers huddled in whispered conversations. Reporters scrambled to piece together a headline, and jurors stretched their legs while exchanging uneasy glances. But the little girl remained in her chair, as if glued there by invisible strings of fear. Her small fingers stroked the worn ear of her stuffed rabbit again and again, each motion deliberate, like the ticking of a clock. She didn't ask for water. She didn't ask for her mother. She didn't even blink much. She just held on, silent as stone. Her mother, finally allowed to approach during the break, crouched beside her. "Baby," she whispered, brushing a curl from her daughter's forehead, "you don't have to be scared. Mommy's right here." The child didn't look at her. She didn't even nod. Instead, she pulled the rabbit tighter to her chest. Her mother's eyes glistened with tears. She dared not let fall in front of the jury. She wanted to scream at the world, at the system, at the cruel necessity of forcing a toddler to shoulder such a burden. How could they expect her baby to carry the weight of truth when she could barely carry her stuffed toy without dragging it across the floor? The prosecutor approached gently, crouching low again. "She doesn't have to tell us everything," she said softly, addressing the mother more than the child. "Even a little bit helps. Even one word. Just one word could make all the difference." But the mother knew her daughter. Silence had become her shield. Every time someone asked a question about what happened, she shut down, retreating into a world no one could reach. A fortress had been built in her mind, brick by brick, fear by fear. The bailiff announced that recess was over, and the shuffle back into the courtroom began. The little girl was escorted back to the witness chair. The room settled once again into silence, heavy and expectant. The prosecutor tried again. "Sweetheart, remember? All you have to do is tell us your name. Just your name. Nothing." The girl's eyes darted toward the clock on the wall, then toward the jury, then down to the floor. She shrank further into the chair, her small body nearly swallowed by it. The defense attorney leaned forward with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Your Honor, This is exactly the point I made earlier. The child is too young, too traumatized, and too unreliable to provide any meaningful testimony. Continuing this examination is bordering on cruelty. The prosecutor's jaw tightened. With respect, counselor, her silence does not erase her truth. The judge rubbed his temples. We'll give her another chance. But we can't force a child to speak. Proceed carefully. The prosecutor turned back to the little girl. Her voice softened again. Do you like your bunny? What's his name? The girl shifted slightly. Her lips parted, just a fraction. For one hopeful second, it looked as though a word might emerge. The jury leaned forward. The prosecutor held her breath. But instead of speaking, the girl raised the rabbit, pressing its soft body against her face, hiding from view. A muffled whimper escaped. Not words, just the sound of fear. The gallery let out a collective sigh. The prosecutor lowered her shoulders. It's all right, she whispered, almost more to herself than to the child. Silence followed. Long, suffocating silence. Every tick of the clock on the wall seemed louder than the last. The jurors began to shift in their seats again, restless and uncertain. The defense attorney scribbled something smug on his legal pad, certain that this silence was evidence enough to dismantle the prosecution's case. For the little girl, the silence was not a choice. It was a prison. She wanted to speak. Some part of her longed to say what she had been holding back. But every time she thought about the words, her stomach tightened, her chest ached, and her throat locked up. It wasn't that she didn't know how to talk. It was that she didn't know how to survive the telling. Inside her mind, pictures replayed like broken film reels. Nights that should have been filled with bedtime stories, but were instead filled with shadows. Faces she trusted that turned cruel. She couldn't put those images into sentences, not while strangers stared at her with pens, ready to catch every sound. She was 3, and 3-year-olds weren't built for this. The prosecutor tried again, choosing a softer angle. Do you like puppies? The little girl blinked. Something flickered in her eyes, a spark, faint but visible. The jury caught it. So did the judge. So did the defense attorney, whose pen stopped mid-note. But just as quickly, the spark vanished. The girl sank back into her chair, rabbit pressed tightly against her chest once again. The prosecutor leaned back, exhaling heavily. She had been here before, with older children, with teenagers. She knew silence could be as loud as any spoken word, but the law demanded articulation. The law didn't recognize whimpers or glances or the language of fear. It wanted testimony. It wanted clarity. The defense attorney stood again, voice clipped with impatience. Your Honor, we are wasting the court's time. This is not testimony. This is not evidence. This is... Sit down, the judge snapped, sharper this time. His gaze softened when it returned to the child. We are not here to rush her. The little girl stared at him then, just for a heartbeat. Her eyes met his. She didn't speak, but her gaze carried something. A plea, a question, perhaps even a test. Could this towering man with a gavel truly protect her if she dared to speak? The judge looked away first, shaken by the intensity of that silent stare. He had sentenced murderers, ruled on fortunes, seen lives ruined and rebuilt. But nothing unsettled him more than the sight of a child too frightened to speak. The silence stretched on. For the jury, it was agonizing. For the prosecutor, it was maddening. For the defense, it was a gift. But for the child, it was survival. And so the courtroom sat, day after day, in a battle not of words, but of waiting. Each question met with silence. Each attempt at comfort met with retreat. It became clear to everyone that the girl's silence wasn't just resistance. It was armor. What no one could yet see was that the armor had cracks. Tiny ones, enough for light to seep through. And when that light came, it would come from the most unexpected place, not from the adults in the room, not from the lawyers or the judge, but from someone who understood her language better than anyone else. But for now, silence reigned. The silence had stopped being just an absence of sound. It had become a living presence in the courtroom. It hung in the air, pressed down on shoulders, seeped into breaths. Every juror, every lawyer, every bystander could feel it. The silence was not neutral. It was not empty. It was heavy, sharp, and cruel, as though each second of it chipped away at the fragile hope that justice might be done. For the prosecution, the weight was unbearable. The child was their key witness, their only unfiltered connection to the truth. Without her words, the case rested on circumstantial evidence and adult testimonies that could be spun and twisted by the defense. Without her voice, the story was incomplete. The prosecutor sat at her table, pen tapping silently against a legal pad. She had handled fragile witnesses before, but none this young, none this small. Children had spoken in her courtrooms, sometimes haltingly, sometimes with tears, but they had spoken. This little girl, however, was different. Her silence wasn't just shyness. It was a wall so high and so fortified that the prosecutor began to wonder if anything could climb it. The defense attorney, meanwhile, relished the silence. Each minute that passed without a word from the girl was another brick in his argument. He could see the jurors shifting in their seats, exchanging uncertain glances. Doubt was taking root, and doubt was his greatest ally. He scribbled notes to himself. Unreliable witness. Incompetent to testify. Case collapsing. But the jury didn't just see silence. They saw the child. They saw her small frame dwarfed by the wooden chair, her rabbit clutched like a lifeline, her lips pressed tightly as though holding back the ocean. And in those details, their hearts tugged. Wasn't her silence, in its own way, evidence of trauma? Didn't it say something profound without saying anything at all? Still, the law demanded more than empathy. The law required words, clarity, sentences that could be recorded in transcripts and weighed against arguments. The law did not know how to translate a whimper or a stare. The judge, weary yet patient, felt the burden more than most. He had been a father before he was a judge, and though he had long since learned to separate the two roles, something about the sight of the little girl eroded that barrier. He kept glancing at her, trying to maintain the stoic neutrality of his position, but his eyes betrayed him. He saw not just a witness, but a child who should have been playing outside in a park, not testifying in a room of strangers about things too dark for her years. The clock ticked. Questions came and went, each one softer, gentler, more coaxing than the last, and each one was swallowed by silence. The prosecutor finally set down her pen. Her eyes lingered on the girl, and in that moment, she felt something shift. It wasn't frustration. It wasn't anger. It was grief. Grief that a child had to sit here at all. Grief that justice for her depended on her ability to do something nearly impossible, to turn pain into words. The mother, seated in the gallery, was unraveling quietly. She pressed her hand against her lips, as if holding back the urge to call out, to rush forward, to scoop her baby up and end this circus. Every fiber of her being screamed that her daughter didn't belong here. She belonged at home, tucked under blankets, with lullabies instead of cross-examinations. One of the jurors couldn't take it anymore. He shifted noisily in his seat, drawing a look from the judge. "Sorry, Your Honor," he muttered. But his eyes remained locked on the girl. The defense attorney smirked inwardly. He could almost hear the jurors thinking, "If she can't talk now, how can we trust anything she says later?" It was all unfolding exactly as he hoped. And yet, under that smug calculation, There was unease. He knew the silence was powerful. Too powerful. Sometimes silence swayed people in ways words never could. If the jury began to see her silence not as incompetence, but as proof of suffering, his carefully constructed arguments could crumble. The bailiff stood like a statue, watching. Even he felt it, the crushing atmosphere, the unbearable weight of a child's silence. He had seen violent criminals shout, scream, confess, even weep. But never had he seen a silence that filled a room so completely. The little girl, oblivious to the strategies playing out around her, was caught in her own battle. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. She wanted to answer, wanted to open her mouth and let out what her mother had told her she must. But every time she tried, the memory came back. A memory not in full sentences, but in flashes. A door slamming, a voice raised, a hand too rough, shadows stretching too long. How could she put those flashes into words? She was only 3. The words didn't exist for her yet. All she had was silence. Her stuffed rabbit was damp now, its fur soaked with the salt of her tears. She pressed her face into it, hoping maybe if she stayed hidden long enough, the questions would stop. The judge finally spoke. "We cannot badger the witness," he said firmly, though his voice carried a trace of sorrow. "She is doing the best she can." But everyone knew her best wasn't enough for the courtroom. Not yet. The prosecutor swallowed hard. She wanted to fight, wanted to push harder, but she knew she risked shattering the fragile child completely. She turned instead to the judge. "Your Honor, if we may, perhaps we can consider alternative methods. Something less intimidating." The judge raised an eyebrow. "What do you suggest?" The prosecutor hesitated. She didn't have an answer yet. But she knew this. If they continued like this, they would lose her. Not just the testimony, but the child herself. She would shut down so deeply that no one would ever reach her again. The defense attorney rose smoothly. "Alternative methods? Your Honor, this is a court of law, not a daycare. If the child cannot testify properly, then her words, or lack thereof, should be dismissed from consideration entirely." His words echoed harshly. The jury shifted again, uncomfortable. The mother clenched her fists. The judge raised his gavel, but didn't strike. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting once more to the child. And in that quiet moment, even he felt the truth of it. This was more than a case. This was a battle between the cold machinery of law and the fragile reality of a child's heart. The silence lingered, pressing down on everyone. But silence never lasts forever. Somewhere, just outside the doors of that courtroom, a solution was waiting. Padded paws, soft fur, a wagging tail. An answer no one in the room could have imagined. But for now, the silence reigned, and its weight was enough to bring even the strongest hearts to their knees. The judge's chambers were quiet, except for the faint scratch of his pen against a yellow notepad. He was scribbling thoughts, not legal arguments, not citations, just fragments of ideas that might soften the impossible weight of the morning's proceedings. For the first time in years, he felt helpless. He had ruled on cases that shook entire communities, had stared into the eyes of murderers, had handled lawyers who treated the courtroom like a battlefield. But never before had he been forced to look at a child, a baby, really, and admit that the system was failing her. The prosecutor sat opposite him, her file spread across the polished wood of the table. "She won't speak," she said softly, almost in apology, though it wasn't her fault. "And forcing her won't work. If we push too hard, we'll lose her completely." The judge rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Then we're left with nothing. The jury can't rule on silence." The defense attorney leaned back smugly in his chair, the faintest of smirks tugging at his lips. "Then perhaps we should acknowledge the truth, Your Honor. This case is falling apart. You cannot drag justice out of a toddler. Dismiss the charges before we waste more of the court's time." The prosecutor's jaw tightened, but before she could respond, the bailiff cleared his throat. There may be another option. 3 pairs of eyes turned to him. The bailiff shifted uneasily. There's a unit in the department. Therapy dogs, trained for trauma cases. They've been used in interviews before, especially with kids. I don't know if the court has ever allowed it during live testimony, but the judge held up a hand, considering. The defense attorney immediately shook his head. Absolutely not. A stunt like that would prejudice the jury. You'd be turning this courtroom into a petting zoo. But the prosecutor leaned forward, her pulse quickening. Let's hear him out. The bailiff nodded. His name's Ace, Golden Retriever. He's been used with kids who couldn't talk otherwise. He doesn't judge. He doesn't stare. He just sits there, calm, quiet. Sometimes that's enough. The judge sat back, folding his hands together. He thought of the child's eyes, wide, frightened, searching for an anchor. Could a dog truly succeed where the law had failed? Finally, he spoke. Bring him in. The courtroom murmured when the side door opened. Reporters craned their necks, pens poised, as the sound of claws clicking softly against the floor echoed through the chamber. Heads turned, eyebrows raised. And then he appeared. Ace was large, his golden coat gleaming under the fluorescent lights, but there was nothing intimidating about him. His gait was steady, measured, almost regal. His handler walked beside him, uniform crisp, leash loose in her hand. Ace didn't bark, didn't strain, didn't look startled by the sea of faces watching him. Instead, his dark, gentle eyes scanned the room, calm and unhurried, until they landed on the smallest figure in the witness chair. The little girl froze. Her stuffed rabbit slipped slightly from her grasp as she stared at the animal padding quietly toward her. Her breath caught. The courtroom held its own collective breath. Ace stopped a few feet away, sitting neatly on his haunches, tail sweeping the floor in a slow rhythm. He didn't move closer. He didn't demand attention. He just sat waiting. The handler crouched beside him, addressing the judge. Your Honor, with permission, Ace is trained to provide emotional support. He won't distract. He won't disrupt. He'll simply be here. The judge nodded slowly, ignoring the defense attorney's whispered protests. Proceed. The prosecutor crouched down, her eyes level with the girl again. Do you see him? She whispered gently, pointing toward Ace. This is Ace. He's here just for you. The girl's eyes widened. She nodded, the first visible acknowledgement she had given all day. The room seemed to soften at once. Would you like to pet him? The prosecutor asked, her voice careful not to rush. For a long moment, the child sat still, her rabbit clutched tightly in one hand. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she reached out her other hand. Ace didn't move. He simply lowered his head slightly, ears relaxed, tail sweeping the floor. When her tiny fingers brushed his fur, his body remained steady, a living statue of patience. The courtroom collectively exhaled. The girl's hand lingered on his fur. Her lips trembled, but this time not from fear. Something else flickered there, the faintest smile. A giggle, quiet as a feather, escaped her lips. The sound was so unexpected, so miraculous in its ordinariness, that it sent shivers through the gallery. The defense attorney stood quickly. Objection, Your Honor. This is highly irregular. This dog is manipulating the witness and the jury. The judge silenced him with a sharp glance. Sit down, counselor. The jury, meanwhile, leaned forward. Their eyes softened as they watched the child stroke Ace's fur. No longer did she look like a trapped bird. For the first time, she looked like a child. The prosecutor seized the moment. "Sweetheart," she whispered, her tone gentler than ever. "Do you want to tell Ace your name?" The little girl hesitated. Her eyes darted to the rows of adults, then back to the golden retriever, whose ears twitched as though he was already listening. She leaned closer, her lips brushing the fur at his ear. A whisper, too soft for anyone else to hear. The handler leaned in, catching the sound. She straightened, her voice steady. She said her name is Lily. Gasps filled the courtroom. Not from shock at the name, but from the miracle of hearing it. The silence had been broken. The judge's gavel struck lightly, more to mark the moment than to restore order. Lily continued to pet Ace, her small voice murmuring words too soft for the courtroom. Each time, the handler repeated them aloud for the record. The defense attorney scowled, furiously scribbling notes. To him, this was chaos, an absurd breach of protocol. But to everyone else, to the jury, the prosecutor, the judge, even the hardened bailiff, it was nothing short of extraordinary. Ace had done what none of them could. He had coaxed a voice from the silence. For Lily, it wasn't magic. It was safety. The dog didn't stare at her like the lawyers. He didn't tap his pen or clear his throat. He didn't ask her to be brave. He just sat there, warm and steady, his fur soft beneath her fingers. She wasn't talking to strangers. She was talking to Ace, and Ace listened. The courtroom, once cold and oppressive, had shifted into something else entirely. It wasn't justice in its usual form, but it was something deeper, a bridge built not from law or logic, but from trust. The judge watched, his throat tight. He had seen witnesses break down, had seen trials collapse under pressure, but he had never seen a golden retriever turn the tide of justice. And yet, as Lily leaned closer to Ace, whispering truths only he could hear, he realized justice doesn't always arrive in the form you expect. Sometimes it comes on four paws, with a wagging tail and a silence more powerful than words. The defense attorney slammed his pen down. "This is outrageous," he muttered under his breath. But his words rang hollow in a room that had already decided. Because in that moment, no one cared about objections or technicalities. They cared about the sound of a child's laughter, the whisper of her name, and the gentle sweep of a tail against the courtroom floor. Justice had found its unlikely ally. The courtroom had grown strangely quiet again, but this silence was different from before. It wasn't suffocating, heavy, or hopeless. It was fragile, like the moment just before a butterfly lands. Everyone was watching, afraid to breathe too loudly, afraid to break the delicate thread that was finally connecting the child to her voice. Ace sat steady as stone beside the witness chair, his eyes fixed on the little girl. His handler, kneeling just a pace away, gave no commands. She didn't need to. Ace knew his job. His training wasn't about tricks or commands, it was about presence. Sometimes presence was more powerful than anything else. Lily's tiny hand rested on his fur. Her fingers were so small against his golden coat that they nearly disappeared. But the way she stroked him was deliberate, slow, and filled with a searching kind of tenderness. Her rabbit was still clutched in her other hand. But for the first time since she had entered the courtroom, the toy was no longer her only anchor. She had another, one that breathed, one that wagged its tail, one that didn't demand anything from her at all. The prosecutor, crouched nearby, caught the shift instantly. She knew not to speak too soon, not to push. The courtroom had already learned that pressure closed Lily off, shut her down like a locked door. But here, with Ace, the lock had begun to turn on its own. The jury leaned forward as one. They weren't trained in law enforcement, nor trauma therapy, but they didn't need training to see what was happening. It was visible in the girl's body language. Gone was the rigid stiffness, the shoulders drawn tight around her ears, the lips pressed into a thin line. In their place was the smallest sign of comfort, her posture loosening, her head tilting slightly toward the dog, her lips curving just enough to hint at a smile. The judge, too, sat back in wonder. He had resisted the idea at first. Allowing a dog into his courtroom felt like breaking rules that had held firm for centuries. But as he watched the child's hand sink into Ace's fur, he realized some rules deserved to bend when justice was at stake. The defense attorney, on the other hand, was fuming. He scribbled furiously on his legal pad, his pen nearly tearing the paper. Manipulation, jury prejudice, grounds for mistrial. His mind churned with objections, but none of them reached his lips. Deep down, he knew the optics were against him now. A 3-year-old child had smiled for the first time all day, and it wasn't because of him. Then it happened. Lily giggled. It wasn't loud, not the kind of laugh that fills a playground or echoes in a hallway. It was small, shy, and trembling. But it was laughter, and it was hers. The sound sent a ripple through the courtroom. Reporters looked up from their notebooks. Jurors glanced at one another, their faces softening. Even the bailiff, who had seen hardened criminals in shackles, felt his throat tighten at the sound. It was so ordinary, so simple, a child's laugh, and yet it was extraordinary in this room where silence had been so suffocating. Ace wagged his tail once, slow and steady, as if to say, "That's it. You're safe now." The prosecutor seized the moment, but carefully, gently. "Lily," she whispered, "Ace likes you. Do you want to tell him something?" The girl tilted her head, considering. She looked at the rows of adults watching her, then back at Ace. Slowly, she leaned forward, pressing her lips close to his ear. A whisper, too faint for anyone else. The handler leaned closer, then straightened. She said, "She told Ace that his fur is soft." Smiles broke across the jury box. Even the judge felt the corners of his mouth lift slightly. Lily pulled back, her cheeks pink. She pressed her bunny to her chest again, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was a shy sort of pride, as if she had just performed a secret trick only Ace could understand. Ace leaned forward then, lowering his head until his nose brushed her arm. She giggled again, a little louder this time, and patted his head. The prosecutor tried once more, her voice still a whisper. "Lily, would you like to tell Ace your bunny's name?" Lily's eyes darted toward the defense attorney, and the judge, and the jury. Too many eyes. Too much weight. She clutched the rabbit tighter. For a moment, it seemed like the silence would return. But then Ace shifted ever so slightly, exhaling a soft huff of air that ruffled the girl's hair. She smiled, leaned in, and whispered again. The handler listened, then repeated. She said, "His name is Mr. Buttons." Another ripple of warmth spread through the room. The prosecutor didn't push further. She knew when to stop. It wasn't about extracting every answer at once. It was about building trust, brick by brick, whisper by whisper. The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is not testimony. This is playtime." "This," the judge cut him off with a sharp glance. "Counselor, sit down." His voice carried more steel than it had all day. For the first time, his patience for the defense's objections had thinned. The attorney sank back into his seat, muttering under his breath. But Lily didn't notice. She was too busy stroking Ace's fur, whispering little secrets that the handler translated carefully into the record. Each word wasn't just a fact. It was a victory. The jury leaned closer, captivated. They weren't hearing polished statements or rehearsed testimony. They were hearing fragments of truth from a child who had been too scared to speak at all. And somehow, those fragments carried more weight than full speeches ever could. The bailiff stood at the edge of the room, arms crossed, but his stern demeanor cracked for a moment as he watched the girl giggle once more. He thought of his own daughter at home, the same age, and felt his chest tighten. He blinked hard, steadying himself. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, not to silence the room, but to mark the moment. "Let the record reflect," he said quietly, "that the witness has identified her rabbit as Mr. Buttons." It seemed like such a small statement. To anyone outside that courtroom, it would sound meaningless. But inside those walls, it was monumental. It meant the silence had been broken. It meant the girl could speak, not to lawyers or judges, but to Ace. And through Ace, her truth could find its way into the open. As the session drew to a close, the judge glanced once more at the child. She sat quietly now, stroking Ace's ears, her rabbit resting on her lap. She wasn't laughing anymore, but she wasn't trembling either. For the first time all day, she looked safe. The judge cleared his throat. "Court will reconvene tomorrow." The gavel struck, and the room erupted into whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously. Jurors exchanged glances. The defense attorney stormed out, muttering about appeals. But Lily didn't notice any of it. She leaned down, pressing her cheek against Ace's fur, whispering one last secret. The handler listened, then smiled faintly. She said, "Thank you." The courtroom, hardened by years of battles and verdicts, felt something it hadn't in a long time. Hope. The next morning, the courtroom felt different. It wasn't the same cold chamber that had swallowed Lily in silence the day before. It hummed with anticipation, as though everyone present knew they stood on the edge of something extraordinary. Even the fluorescent lights seemed softer, casting a glow that made the wood of the benches gleam. Ace padded in quietly, his tail swishing once-twice as though greeting the room. His presence settled everyone. The jurors straightened in their seats, reporters poised their pens, and the judge adjusted his glasses with a faint, expectant nod. But it was Lily who transformed the most when she saw him. Yesterday, she had entered like a shadow, rigid, pale, clutching her stuffed rabbit so tightly it seemed she might crush it. Today, her grip on Mr. Buttons was looser, her small shoulders not quite so high around her ears. When Ace trotted toward her, she leaned forward, the faintest flicker of relief softening her face. He sat beside her, lowering his head onto the edge of the witness stand. She reached for him without hesitation, her tiny hand disappearing in his fur. The courtroom breathed again. The prosecutor rose slowly, careful not to break the fragile thread between child and dog. Her voice was gentle, steady. "Good morning, Lily." The girl didn't answer. She rarely did when strangers spoke. But her fingers continued to stroke Ace's ear, and her lips moved, whispering something only he could hear. The handler leaned closer, listening. Then she nodded. "She says good morning back." The jury exchanged glances, smiles flickering at the corners of their mouths. It was working again. The bridge between silence and speech was holding. The prosecutor crouched slightly, her eyes soft. "Lily, yesterday you told Ace about your bunny. Do you remember that?" The girl's head tilted, her lips brushing against Ace's ear once more. A whisper. "She remembers," the handler said aloud. "Good," the prosecutor said warmly. "And today, if you feel safe, maybe you can tell Ace about something else. Something only you know." The defense attorney leapt to his feet. "Objection. This is leading the witness." The judge cut him off with a sharp bang of the gavel. "Overruled." "Sit down, counselor," the prosecutor continued, her focus never leaving the girl. "Lily, Ace is listening. He's very good at keeping secrets. Would you like to tell him about the day you saw the bad man?" The air changed instantly. The jury shifted forward. Reporters froze, pens suspended mid-air. Even the bailiff's jaw tightened. For the first time, Lily stopped petting Ace. Her hand froze, hovering uncertainly above his head. Her rabbit slipped slightly in her lap. The silence stretched, heavy again, threatening to collapse the fragile progress. The prosecutor felt her own heart pounding. She was asking too much. Too soon. Then Ace moved. Not much. Just a gentle nudge of his nose against Lily's hand, urging it down until it rested on his fur again. His body was warm, solid, unshakable. Lily blinked. Her lips trembled. And then, slowly, she leaned forward, pressing her mouth against Ace's ear. A whisper, longer this time, a string of words. The handler listened, her face pale as she absorbed the fragile voice. Then she lifted her head. She says, she saw the bad man hurt her mommy. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, muffled exclamations, pens scratching furiously. The defense attorney shot up, shouting objections about hearsay and procedure. The judge pounded his gavel, his voice cutting through the chaos. Order! Order in the court! But Lily didn't flinch this time. She stayed pressed against Ace, her tiny hand buried deep in his fur, as if his golden coat shielded her from the storm. When the room quieted, the prosecutor's voice returned, softer than ever. Lily, can you tell Ace what the bad man looked like? Again, the hesitation. Again, the trembling lips. But Ace didn't move. He simply breathed, steady and slow, like an anchor. Lily whispered, longer this time. The handler's eyes widened as she translated. She says, he had a black hat, and a scar on his cheek, and he smelled like smoke. The jury stiffened. Details. Clear, vivid details. The prosecutor's heart pounded. Lily, do you see the bad man in this room today? The question hung in the air like a knife. The defense attorney was already halfway to his feet, shouting, objection, leading, prejudicial, but his voice cracked under the weight of the moment. Lily's eyes moved, slowly, hesitantly. She scanned the rows of adults, the jurors, the spectators, the reporters scribbling frantically, and then her gaze stopped on the man sitting at the defense table. The defendant shifted uneasily under her stare, tugging at his collar. His jaw tightened, and for the first time during the trial, he looked unsettled. Lily's lips brushed Ace's ear. Her whisper was short, but certain. The handler's voice broke slightly as she repeated, she says, it's him. The courtroom froze. Every eye turned to the defendant. The jurors' expressions hardened, pens scratched furiously, and the prosecutor felt a surge of triumph and grief all at once. The defense attorney's face went pale. His objections tumbled out, unreliable testimony, improper influence, prejudicial identification. But his words sounded hollow, drowned beneath the weight of a child's truth. The judge leaned forward, his voice low and steady. The record will reflect that the witness has identified the defendant. The prosecutor pressed no further. She knew she had what she needed. Pushing Lily beyond this moment would risk shattering the fragile courage she had found. Instead, she crouched lower, her voice a whisper only the girl and Ace could truly feel. You did so well, Lily. So well. Lily buried her face against Ace's neck, whispering one last secret. The handler wiped her eyes as she translated. She says, Ace kept me safe. The jury melted. The judge blinked hard, clearing his throat before striking the gavel to adjourn for the day. When the court emptied, whispers filled the halls. Reporters rushed to file stories about the dog who broke the silence. Jurors spoke quietly among themselves, their eyes haunted by the image of a child pointing without words. Even the bailiff, usually stone-faced, wiped his eyes when no one was looking. Inside the courtroom, Lily refused to let go of Ace. She clung to him with both hands, Mr. Buttons dangling from her lap, forgotten for the first time. Ace stood patiently, letting her hold him, breathing steady, his tail swishing softly. The judge lingered, watching the unlikely pair. He knew the law was not written for moments like these. Statutes and procedures had no room for a golden retriever who could coax the truth from silence. And yet, what had happened here today was justice in its purest form. For the first time, he believed they might reach the truth. And for the first time, Lily believed she was safe enough to speak. The courtroom was never truly silent. Even when the gavel struck, even when words ceased, there was always a hum, the faint scrape of pens against paper, the rustle of jackets, the shuffling of shoes. But after Lily's testimony, the hum was different. It wasn't restless anymore. It was charged. Every sound carried the weight of what had just been said. Reporters filed dispatches with frantic hands, headlines already taking shape. Child breaks silence with dog's help. Little girl identifies suspect in court. Police canine becomes key witness. The jurors looked changed, too. The stoic mask they had worn at the beginning of the trial had cracked. Their eyes followed Lily as she left the stand that day, Ace at her side, her rabbit tucked under one arm. Some smiled faintly. Others pressed their lips tight, haunted by what they had witnessed. The defense attorney knew it. He saw the way the jury leaned toward the girl's words, the way the prosecutor held herself taller, her shoulders squared with quiet triumph. And he knew if he didn't tear apart what had just happened, his client's fate was sealed. The next morning, the defendant entered the courtroom with a forced calm, but sweat glistened at his hairline. He adjusted his tie, avoiding the gaze of the spectators. For weeks, he had smirked and lounged in his chair, confident that no one could pin him down. But now, the weight of a child's whisper clung to him heavier than any chain. The defense attorney pounced immediately. "Your Honor," he began, rising with a crisp shuffle of papers. "The so-called testimony provided yesterday is inadmissible." What occurred was not testimony at all, but a highly prejudicial spectacle designed to sway the jury through emotion. The prosecutor rose at once. "With respect, Your Honor," the child identified the defendant clearly and provided descriptive details only someone present at the scene could know. Whether her words were delivered directly into a microphone or whispered to a therapy dog does not change the truth. The judge frowned, fingers steepled beneath his chin. He had spent the night replaying the moment in his mind, the girl's trembling hand in the dog's fur, her whisper, her eyes locking on the defendant. It was unorthodox, unprecedented even. But it was also undeniable. The defense pressed on. "We are not running a kennel, Your Honor. This is a courtroom. To allow a canine to act as intermediary testimony opens a dangerous precedent. What next? Parrots repeating witness statements? This is absurd." Snickers rippled through the gallery, but the judge silenced them with a sharp glare. He turned to the prosecutor. "Your response?" She straightened, her voice calm. The child was too traumatized to speak directly. The therapy dog provided the safety she needed to communicate. The handler merely repeated her words. The content remains hers. The law is meant to serve justice, not strangle it in red tape. The judge's gavel tapped once. Motion denied. The testimony stands. A collective exhale filled the room. The defense attorney sank into his chair, his jaw clenched, but his eyes flickered toward the jury, and he saw it. The decision was slipping away from him, over the next hours. The prosecution presented additional witnesses. Neighbors who had seen the defendant near the home. Forensic experts who tied cigarette ash on the windowsill to his brand. Officers who testified about his past violent record, but none of it landed with the same weight as Lily's whispers. The jurors listened politely, nodding here and there. but their minds kept circling back to the tiny voice that had cracked open the silence. Evidence gave them logic. Lilly gave them truth. The defense attorney knew logic was his only chance. He tore into every witness with venom, dissecting inconsistencies, hammering on doubts. With Lilly's age, he attacked most viciously. "She's 3 years old," he snarled in his closing remarks. 3. Do you trust a toddler's memory to decide a man's fate? A toddler who cannot speak in public, who can only whisper into a dog's ear. This is not justice. This is a circus act. The so-called testimony is nothing but projection. The handler, the prosecutor, all spoon-feeding a frightened child what to say. His voice rose, sharp and desperate. "Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you, would you condemn a man to life behind bars on the word of a toddler? On the word of a stuffed rabbit and a golden retriever? If the state cannot prove its case without theatrics, then the state has not proven its case at all." The courtroom stirred. He was angry, persuasive, the kind of lawyer who could turn outrage into persuasion. For a moment, the jury wavered, not because they believed him, but because doubt is a stubborn seed. But then the prosecutor rose, and the air shifted once more. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her voice was steady, almost maternal, as though speaking directly to the jurors' hearts. "Yes, Lilly is 3 years old," she began. 3 years old, and already she has seen more horror than most of us will see in a lifetime. Yes, she could not speak directly to us, because the trauma she carries silenced her. But silence does not erase truth. It only buries it, until something or someone gives it a chance to rise. She turned, gesturing toward Ace, lying peacefully beside the witness stand. That someone was Ace, not me, not her handler, not anyone else. It was him. He gave her safety. And in that safety, she spoke. Not words given to her, not scripts. Her own truth, her own memory, her own courage. The prosecutor's voice trembled slightly, but she held steady. "You heard her. You saw her." She pointed to the man who did this. Not because she was coached, not because she was tricked, because she knew, and because Ace made her feel safe enough to tell us. She paused, letting the silence settle. Then, softly, "Do not dismiss her because she is small. Do not silence her because she is young. Listen to her because she is the only one who was there when her mother needed saving." The courtroom was hushed. The jurors sat frozen, some with misted eyes, others with jaws set in determination. The judge gave his final instructions, his voice heavy with gravity. "Members of the jury, you will now retire to deliberate. Remember your oath, to weigh the evidence fairly, to seek the truth, and to render a verdict in accordance with justice." The jurors filed out. The door closed. The waiting began. In the gallery, whispers buzzed like bees. Reporters speculated in hushed tones. The defense attorney sat rigid, sweat pooling at his temples. The prosecutor sat still, hands folded, her gaze occasionally drifting toward Ace, who lay calmly by the bench, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But Lilly sat with Ace in a quiet room down the hall, away from the chaos. She nestled against his side, Mr. Buttons tucked under her arm, her tiny fingers tangled in his golden fur. For once, she wasn't whispering. She was humming, soft and tuneless, the kind of sound children make when they are finally, blessedly safe. Hours passed. The tension stretched, each minute heavier than the last. Then, at last, the jury returned. The foreman clutched the verdict slip in his hand. His face was unreadable. The judge nodded solemnly. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreman's voice was steady. "We have, Your Honor." The room held its breath, and in that breathless space, where silence pressed harder than ever before, Justice hung in the balance, waiting to be spoken aloud. The courtroom was heavy with silence, the kind that presses down like a storm cloud moments before the rain breaks. Every person present, the judge, the attorneys, the jurors, the gallery, even the reporters scribbling furiously in their notepads, felt the weight of it. The jury had returned. The foreman clutched a slip of paper between his fingers, folded so tightly it looked as though it might tear. His face revealed nothing, trained into a mask of solemn duty, but his eyes betrayed him. They were tired, heavy from hours of debate, and perhaps from the knowledge that the fate of a man and the healing of a child balanced on the words he was about to speak. The judge's gavel tapped once, sharp against the wood. "Members of the jury," he said gravely, "have you reached a unanimous verdict?" The foreman rose. "We have, Your Honor." The defendant shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles whitened. For weeks he had sat smug, confident, untouchable. Now sweat glistened on his brow, and his chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. The defense attorney leaned close, whispering something sharp in his ear, but the man barely nodded. His gaze flickered toward the jury box, searching desperately for some sign, some mercy. Across the room, the prosecutor sat still, her hands folded neatly on the table. She didn't look at the jury. She didn't even look at the defendant. Her eyes lingered on the closed door, leading to the hallway where she knew Lily sat with Ace. For her, the verdict wasn't about winning. It was about whether justice would finally give a child her voice back. The foreman cleared his throat. In the matter of the state versus John D. Keller, we, the jury, find the defendant. The pause stretched like a taut rope, pulling tighter with every heartbeat. Guilty. On all counts. The words slammed into the room like a thunderclap. For a moment, no one moved. Then the sound began. A gasp from the gallery, a muffled cry from someone in the front row, the frantic scratching of reporters' pens. Jurors shifted in their seats, some nodding faintly, others sitting rigid, but all carrying the weight of their decision. The prosecutor exhaled for the first time in hours, her shoulders sagging with relief. She closed her eyes briefly, silently thanking the golden retriever who had made this moment possible. The defense attorney sprang to his feet, shouting, "Objection! This is a miscarriage of justice." The testimony was tainted, the process compromised. The judge's gavel crashed down with authority. "Sit down, counselor. The jury has spoken." His voice rang like iron, final and unshakable. The defendant swore under his breath, slamming his fist against the table. Bailiffs closed in, firm hands gripping his arms, ready to escort him back into custody. His outburst only hardened the impression left on the jury, the image of a man whose temper matched the violence he was accused of. Down the hall, in a quiet side room, Lily sat cross-legged on the floor with Ace beside her. She didn't understand the legal words, the verdict, or what guilty on all counts meant. But she understood something had changed. The air in the courthouse felt lighter. The adults who came in and out no longer carried the same tightness in their shoulders, the same sharp whispers. And when the prosecutor entered, her eyes shimmering with tears she didn't bother to hide, Lily knew. "It's over," the prosecutor whispered, kneeling down to Lily's level. "You did it. You were so brave." Lily blinked, her hand resting against Ace's fur. She tilted her head, as if considering whether the words were really for her. Then, slowly, she whispered into Ace's ear. The handler leaned in, smiling through tears. "She says." Ace was brave too. The prosecutor's heart cracked open. She reached forward, but didn't touch the girl, not wanting to break the fragile bond that had carried them here. Instead, she looked at Ace, his golden eyes calm and steady, and mouthed the words, "Thank you." Back in the courtroom, The judge delivered the sentencing date and dismissed the jurors. Some left with shoulders squared, proud of their decision. Others lingered, their eyes drifting toward the empty witness chair, haunted by the image of a 3-year-old's trembling lips whispering truth into a dog's ear. The reporters swarmed out, phones already buzzing with editors demanding headlines. By the evening, the story would flood every news outlet. Toddler breaks silence with help of police dog. Historic verdict secured. But inside the courthouse, in that small, quiet room, the story was much simpler. It was just a child, a rabbit, and a golden retriever. When Lily was finally escorted outside with her guardian, cameras flashed, questions flew, and microphones stretched forward. But she clung to Ace, burying her face in his neck, and the handler shielded her from the noise. One reporter shouted, "Is it true the dog cracked the case?" Another yelled, "What did she say to him?" But Ace didn't answer, and Lily didn't need to. As they reached the waiting car, Lily tugged gently on Ace's ear and whispered again. The handler bent close, listening. Then she looked up at the prosecutor and smiled. "She says, 'Ace is my hero.'" The prosecutor covered her mouth with her hand, holding back a sob. That night, the courthouse stood empty. The echo of footsteps had faded. The press had packed up their cameras, and the defendant sat in a cold cell awaiting his fate. But in one small home, Lily slept peacefully for the first time in months. Mr. Buttons was tucked under her arm, but it wasn't the stuffed rabbit that kept the nightmares at bay. It was the memory of golden fur, steady breathing, and the quiet strength of a dog who had given her voice back. Ace, curled at the foot of her bed on special permission, lifted his head once during the night when she stirred. He wagged his tail softly, lowered his head again, and closed his eyes. His job wasn't finished, not really. But for tonight, at least, justice had been served. And for the first time since the day her world had shattered, Lily was safe. The case would be remembered for years, not just for its verdict, but for its method. Law schools would debate it. Judges would argue about its precedent. Reporters would reprint it every time another child faced the impossible burden of testimony. But those who had been there knew the truth. The verdict wasn't won in cross-examinations or closing arguments. It wasn't delivered by clever rhetoric or forensic evidence. It was won in whispers, fragile, trembling whispers spoken into a golden retriever's ear. And it was carried, not by law, but by trust. By a child. By a dog. By the bond that bridged silence and justice.